um, as it's 7 o'clock. Welcome everyone to this webinar, the What's Wrong with the Global Economy webinar with Costas Lapavitsas. I
That's right.
get it right the second time. Apologies.
That's right.
And
No problem.
this is the first session of our second year of strategy series, and I'm really looking forward to it because the last series was excellent. My name's Sarah Woolley. I'm the General Secretary of the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union and the President of the GFTU. This is our first session of the 2025-2026 education programme. We've got over 90 courses which go across online and residential this year. So make sure that you have a look through the programme and get your places booked as soon as possible, because we've already had a couple of sold out courses already. Like last year, all sessions from this particular series will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so do catch up on ones that you missed last year, and you can catch up on these and watch them back again as well. If you can, we ask that you consider donating to our educational trust and become a friend of the GFTU Educational Trust, which helps us continue delivering much needed radical independent education for the whole trade union movement. So what is this series about? Strategy is not just a word. Strategy is about how we all within the trade union and wider labour movement build the power and capacity to improve workers' lives. The employers have a strategy, the managers have a strategy, and it's absolutely vital that as a united labour movement, we build our own too. This series will include discussions from leading thinkers on reviving the trade union movement, how we build a strategy, the role of women and feminist approaches to our unions, strategies for developing activists, and the capacity to win campaigns big and small. So I am delighted to introduce Costas. Before I bring you in properly, I'll just do a bit of a blurb and let people know how it works. Costas is the Professor of Economics at the School of Oriental and African Studies in the University of London. His research during the last few years has focused on the Eurozone and the financialisation of capitalism. He's been published widely in the academic field, taught at several well-known universities, and writes for the international and the Greek press. And I didn't know this until tonight, and I probably do, but it had not stuck in my brain, that in January 2015 you were elected into Greek Parliament with the incoming Syriza party. That blew my mind, that did. His most recent books include The State of Capitalism, Economy, Society and Hegemony, Capitalism in the Ottoman Balkans, The Left Case Against the EU, Against the Troika, Crisis and Austerity in the Eurozone, and Profiting Without Producing. This is a webinar, which means you can see us, but you cannot see each other and we can't see you. Feel free to use the chat throughout the call, but specifically to ask questions, please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. I'll then ask those questions directly to Costas after he's done his kind of 30-minute presentation. So we'll give Costas 30 minutes. And then we'll open up to your questions. And during the call, we'll be following the GFTU educational behaviour statement, which the link is in the chat now. If you've got any concerns, please read and follow that policy. So enough from me, because you've not come to listen to me. Over to you, Costas, and I'm really looking forward to hearing you for the next 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Sarah. It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invite. I do think that this series of lectures and seminars is of great importance because the trade union movement in this country, but also in Europe and elsewhere, needs to get full and better knowledge of what's happening across the world economy and across the British economy as well, not just sectoral concerns or specific enterprise corporate concerns, but across the economy. Very, very important for the trade union movement to have a general understanding of how the economy is performing in order to be able to formulate its own strategy. And I should say that at the outset, and I'll have more to say as we move along, what's missing in Britain at the moment, but also in Europe and elsewhere, is the independent voice of trade unions on precisely this issue. What should we be doing with the macroeconomy? How should we be conducting our affairs at the general level, the macro level, not the sectoral level, not the corporate level, but the general level? For that, we need knowledge. And uh, I want to introduce some ideas today, and I want to discuss, and I want to see what people think in connection with what I've got to propose. Now, the remit I was given was not modest, let's put it that way. What's the state of the world economy? You can appreciate that this is a big thing. So I will generalize to a certain extent. I will tell you what I think the broad characteristic features are of how the world economy in the advanced core is behaving. And then I will try and place Britain within that, because obviously, in the end of the day, we're primarily concerned with our own country and where we are. Now, let me give you some numbers, first of all, so that you don't think I'm making this up as I'm going along. Let's start with some hard facts about where we are in 2025. The world and Britain, so we know where we are. Now, if we look at growth, which is the first port of call for understanding the world economy, growth in the 2020s so far has been around 1.5%. This is the worst performance since the 1970s. Right? That's point number one. Let's be clear about that, because you look at the press, you will never guess that. So growth in this decade is worse than in the previous decade, and it is the worst so far than it's been in the late 1970s. At the same time, we've got significant inflation persisting still, as you know. I'll give you the figures for Britain as we move along, which makes life for working people particularly difficult. The cost of living crisis, that I will have more to say on as we move along, is obviously connected to persistent inflation, right? Now, that goes together with weakness of disposable income. Disposable income is how people manage their lives, right? It's the wages they make and the way taxes and so on eat into that. And disposable income in this country has been declining. Disposable income elsewhere in Europe has been stagnant. In the United States, it's been edging up a little bit, nothing to write home about. So the lives of working people in Britain have been getting worse. That's precisely what we mean by the cost of living crisis. The lives of working people elsewhere in the developed world have not been doing much better either. It's not as if incomes and disposable income and livelihoods are getting better, which goes together with weak growth, of course. That's not that surprising. Now, underneath all this is, of course, weak investment. See, the engine of the capitalist economy, what makes it tick is investment. That's, after all, what big businesses and capitalists are supposed to do. They're supposed to invest. Well, investment in this country in particular has been appalling for years. Private and especially public investment, non-existent really. But investment elsewhere has also been weak. So private enterprise doesn't particularly invest in the advanced countries. That's been characteristic of the last many, many years, and clearly this decade. I mean, I could go on, and I don't. I think I'm giving you a picture of how things stand, but I've got to mention a couple of other things just to put it in context. While all this has been happening, in other words, weak growth and in this country declining disposable income, debt has been increasing. So we are swimming in an ocean of debt. Debt, if you add it up across the world economy, is bigger than ever. And the biggest component, and we'll have occasion to talk about that, is obviously public debt. Not private debt now, it's public debt. It's actually the government and states that are borrowing very heavily. Now, there's a lot of discussion in this country about public debt in Britain, and we know the trouble it has created for the Labour government in recent years, but also the Tory government before it. But it isn't a British characteristic, let me assure you. This has been happening in France. It's been happening in other countries across Europe, and it's been happening in the United States too, which is indebted to the eyeballs. Okay? So public debt and debt generally has been what has been keeping this weakly performing economy afloat. That's a very important thing to bear in mind. The last thing I want to mention is that trade, which we have been told many, many times in this country, is the secure guide to wealth and prosperity. Trade has not been doing very well across the world. It's not declining, but it's not growing. And clearly, what has led to that, the last the last 6 months, is of course Donald Trump. Donald Trump and the tariffs that he's imposed have led to weaker growth of trade. So altogether, then, a picture of a world economy that's not quite collapsing. It's not falling apart, for sure, but it's not going anywhere. Working people are feeling the pressure across the board. Disposable incomes are either falling or stagnant, and what's keeping it going is basically debt. Now, the UK within this broader picture is one of the worst cases. And I want to stress that because obviously, in the end of the day, it's our own country that we're primarily concerned about. Growth is at its weakest, barely above 1%. Inflation is fairly high. Disposable incomes are falling. The government is heavily indebted. And crucially, the productivity of labor, the engine of wealth, because all wealth comes from labor in the end of the day, and all wealth comes from productivity of labor. The productivity of labor has been stagnant the last 5 years, and actually in the UK for far longer than that. So it's a picture of UK capitalism hitting the buffers. That's basically where we are, not really going anywhere. The question is, what should the trade union movement do in connection with that? What should we propose? What kind of strategies shall we put forth? How to deal with this? In the UK, I should say, this is of particular salience, this issue. And the reason is the British elite, the people who make the decisions, are obviously at a loss. It's clear. They don't know what to do. I mean, I've never seen it more clearly evidenced than now. There are no new ideas. There are no new proposals. Nothing really in politics and elsewhere about how to deal with this very, very difficult predicament of the British economy, British society, and the British people. Right? How to deal with the difficulty of making ends meet. The trade union movement, in a sense, has an obligation to its members, an obligation to the nation as a whole, to come up with proposals that will make sense from the workers' side and that will begin to tilt the debate in the direction in which we want it to go. We must not allow this confused lot of people with power at the top of our society, which have brought us to this pass, to muddle through again. We must not allow that. And I want to give some ideas about how that might happen. Now, let's put it in broader context then, in order to understand what we should propose. Political economy, which is what the trade union movement should be interested in, always takes a historical perspective. You can't ignore the broader side of things, where we come from and what has shaped where we are. And really, when you do that, when you look at the broader picture, the situation turned bad. Things began to turn pear-shaped and go south after the great crisis of 2007, 2009. That's really the turning point. 15 years ago or so, more than 15 years ago now. That's really when things began to turn. After that gigantic crisis, which nearly destroyed the Western financial system and brought the economies to several economies to their knees, things never really picked up after that. Um, After that came, of course, the pandemic shock, you might remember in 2020, 2021, which was also very severe. And it was similar to what happened in the great crisis of 2007, 2009. But really, the decisive moment was 15 years ago. Now, what happened then? What happened then was that really what we call the globalization of capitalism and the financialization of capitalism, these two very, very important trends that we see in the world economy the last 4 decades, went past their peak. That's really what happened. That crisis signified the peak of globalization and the peak of financialization. Now, what is globalization? Now, the easiest way to understand it is as the growth of global trade. In other words, big business begins to cross borders and begins to trade across borders freely because controls and regulations are lifted. But more than that, big business begins to invest across borders. It isn't just trade, it's actually establishing production capacity, beginning to produce across borders, beginning to take advantage of cheap labor, favorable conditions, closeness to raw materials, closeness to new technologies, and so on. And big business begins to do that. Now, enterprises across the advanced world, including in Britain, began to do that, began to shift capacity abroad, began to send manufacturing capacity across borders for a long time. And that became the dominant way of producing. Global value chains, they're called, or global production chains. In other words, interconnection of production across borders, production going back and forth, crossing borders several times, and things ending up on the shelf after having gone through half a dozen countries. And that doesn't only happen for manufacturing, it happens with all sorts of things. Fish can be taken out of the sea off the shore of Britain. It can be sent over to some European country to be cleaned up, and then it can come back to Britain to be packaged and sold on, and so on. This is supposed to be efficient. Well, it doesn't take long to realize that actually it isn't how it looks. It might be more profitable for the businesses involved, but it's not necessarily more efficient, and it certainly isn't good for the environment, which is another major concern. But that tendency, that way of doing things, crossing borders and producing across borders and taking advantage of favorable wage conditions and so on, peaked in 2007, 2009. Since then, it's never really regained the same dynamism. Foreign direct investment in 2025, should have mentioned earlier, but I didn't because I didn't want to fill you with numbers, is very weak. So the dynamism is not there. Why? Because the global value chains have proven to be delicate, susceptible to shocks, and susceptible, of course, to tariffs and controls and imposition of sovereign power by a number of countries that have realized that it's about time we started making things locally rather than simply buying them. The great financial crisis of 2007, 2009 showed that very clearly. This country had the difficulty of obtaining masks, for God's sake. And it wasn't just us. It was across Europe. Do you know where France got its masks from? From Morocco. France found itself in hock to Morocco because it couldn't make masks. So that peaked then. So that's the first thing that happened. The second thing that happened in that crisis is that financialization also peaked. Financialization now is the second big trend of contemporary capitalism, and that is something which all of us experience in our everyday lives, especially in this country, which is one of the main points, one of the main sites of financialization globally. The incredible growth of finance, the disproportionate rise of finance within the economy And in this country, it's of course the City of London and everything that goes with it. Now, financialization has characterized the global economy for a very long time. Throughout those last 4 or 5 decades, Britain is at the forefront. That peaked as a dynamic process in 2007, 2008, because of course finance caused the crisis in the end of the day. It was the bankers that were behind it and the speculative activities in which they engaged. Now, we remain financialized. Let me assure you of that. It's not as if it's gone away. The City of London especially is incredibly powerful. The advanced countries remain financialized, but there's no dynamism in the same way that we saw leading up to that great crisis. The banks got their wings clipped because they had caused a lot of damage and so on. And what has emerged since then, and you should be clear about it, is as the banks have retreated, is the rise of investment funds, BlackRock, institutions of that type. These are not bankers, they're financial institutions, but they're not bankers. And what they do is they gamble in the stock market. They buy and sell securities. That's the type of financialization that has grown since then, without the same dynamism, but still with us. And they dictate terms. It is this type of financial institution which is very influential in the United States and in this country, even more than the banks, and everything is geared to their interests. And that has been the broad characterization of where the world economy has gone and where Britain is. Now, I've been speaking for about 15 or so minutes, 20 or so minutes, and I can say a lot more about that. But I think I've given you a picture that is sufficient for discussion. I want to come up with some ideas about how to deal with that and what does it mean from our perspective, because this kind of capitalism, which obviously has lost its dynamism now, obviously doesn't go anywhere particularly, as is proven by the figures I gave you to begin with. No growth, no income increases, and so on. Is persistent. It will be with us for a while. And it calls for decisive answers. Now, if you try and get some sense from what, say, major governments in Europe are saying, you won't succeed. It doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't add up. It's in this context that the trade unions must come out, I believe, and confidently argue for a new economic policy at that level. An economic policy that seeks to tilt the balance away from capital towards labor, away from finance and away from globalization towards production, labor, strengthening the domestic economy, and beginning to produce wealth again, rather than circulate papers and make money out of transacting in derivatives and all the rest of the stuff that the financial sector specializes in. So what I would argue then is that the policies that we need to put across are policies that seek to rebalance the economy in Britain, but also elsewhere, away from finance. We need to definancialize the economy. We need to re-strengthen the production sector. Let me give you some numbers so you see what I mean. The manufacturing sector of the British economy right now is only 8% of GDP. Britain is deindustrialized. We don't have much of an industry anymore, right? We need to argue in this context, given what has been happening to the world economy and to us in the world economy, that we need to strengthen the productive side of the economy. That's the policies we need. We need to strengthen the productive side, and we need to begin to manufacture things again in Britain. Now, I'm not the first one to think of that, I have to say. Even the Labour government is now beginning to argue for an industrial strategy. Suddenly, people have discovered the merits of industry. But be careful how that is argued. A lot of people would say that we need to strengthen our industry again by going for advanced manufacturing. All the sexy sounding things like AI and so on. Now, I'm not against that at all. Of course, we need that. But you've got to realize, given the destruction that's been wrought to the productive structure of this country over the last 4 or 5 decades, that we must start with foundational industries there will be no growth of the productive side unless we also methodically strengthen our foundational industries. The foundational industries here, it's a very clear thing. It's not rocket science. We need to start making some steel again. We need to start making some chemicals again. We need to start making some aluminum again. We need to start making some machine tools again. Obviously, I don't expect Britain to outcompete China because we've just lost that fight, right? Because of what our governments have done. But Britain producing 7 million metric tons of steel a year is beyond a joke. It's nothing, right? We need some capacity of the foundational industries, of machine tooling and so on, in order to begin seriously thinking about how to strengthen our productive side and focus on the advanced manufacturing too. So I would say that we need a policy that does that, that aims for stronger manufacturing and thinks of manufacturing as a complex whole, starting with the foundationals and moving to the advanced industries. Within that, the most important element is labor. I want to stress that because people get carried away with technologies, investment. If there isn't the labor, nothing will happen, right? So the first port of call here in rebuilding productive capacity in this country and getting out of the pickle in which we find ourselves, and that holds for other advanced countries too, not just Britain, but we are one of the worst cases, is labor. We need to think seriously of where we're going to get the additional labor we need in order to strengthen our productive capacity, how we're going to shift labor away from services towards the productive sector, how we're going to get people out of the inactive labor force. We've got 9 million people who are inactive in the labor force right now. We need to get people out of the inactive labor force, and we need to think of what kind of immigration policy we need in order to do that. We need to think of how people are remunerated. They need better wages, they need better conditions, and they need better jobs to be created. If you want the productivity of labor to rise, you've got to give people incentive to work harder. So the first port of call is labor. But obviously, we also need to think of investment. Britain needs a wave of investment. The weakness of investment is behind this poor performance. Britain needs a wave of investment, and the leading role here must be played by public investment that will also pull private investment with it. Don't let anyone tell you that public investment drives out private investment. It's the opposite. If there is public investment, it will crowd in private investment. Public investment then is what we need, and we need a financial system that will allow this to happen. But the crucial point here is, as public investment happens, public wealth should rise. We should not invest publicly in order to allow private enterprises to make profits, so that the British people, the state, takes the risk, and private capital makes the profits. If we invest publicly, which we should, across a range of industries, then we take ownership over the investment and we begin to build public wealth again. Britain needs a stock of public wealth. It needs it urgently, and the way to acquire it is through a wave of investment that will also help it improve productivity and improve growth. We need more workers, as I said before, but we need more capital per worker so that the workers can raise their productivity. Because if you simply increase the number of workers without giving them capital to work with, then you're not going very far. So we need a strategy that does that. The last point I want to mention here, and I've already hinted at it, is that none of this will happen unless we also restructure, reform, and intervene in the financial system. If you want definancialization to happen, if you want the power of the City of London to decline, which it should, for the economy to start to do better, then we need to think carefully and systematically about a public investment bank that will allow this program to stand on its own 2 feet. And we should also think about publicly spirited controls over trade and over capital flows. We need to think outside the box, in other words. It's time to reject the failed economic philosophies of the last 40 years, the neoliberalism that has destroyed the British economy, the neoliberalism that's been dominant for 4 decades and has brought us to this impossible pass. I want to stress Britain is in the weakest position it has found itself in for a very long time. In some ways, it is worse than after the Second World War. You see, after the Second World War, Britain had to put itself back on its feet through a wave of restructuring, but it still had an industry. Now it finds itself in a position in which it has itself, by itself, destroyed these industries. So it needs to understand that it's in a very weak position, weaker than other advanced countries, and it needs to pull itself up by its own bootstraps. And only Labour can begin to put these ideas on the table. The organized labor movement must open up this national debate and forcefully argue for some of these ideas through debate, obviously, and through examination of the specific issues. Then maybe we will see things changing. Maybe we will see, hopefully, things improving for in the interest and to the benefit of the majority of the people of this country. That's what I had to say. I've spoken long enough. Let's open it up. Let's take questions and see if we can find some answers through discussion.